basing this more, obviously like open to everyone, since it's a roundtable discussion, but basing this on Khalil's presentation, what was the initial sort of step you took while, in your current construction of the buildings? What was the sort of initial response to like what to change and what to make better and like where to start from? And I guess how to reassure the people that these will perhaps be a better way of, or perhaps a solution to the situation. So what was your starting point or the main thing you considered structurally and in any other way that you can respond with? What was the first thing that you considered commencing your project?
On two big-scale projects that are about the reconstruction. One that is directly with this promoter. So we created, he had already at disposition these 7 acres. So he really took a lot of the asset that was basically on the shoulder of the government. So he basically tried to create a facilitation to do this, let's say, model project. But there is also another operation which is more directly to the government, which follows another approach, which is a case-by-case project. We're trying to avoid more the rehabilitation of the villages. So basically, we have 2 approaches. See, the first map that was developed is a map of areas that can allow you or not allow you to rebuild in this village. This was created right after the earthquake that changed a lot of the decisions. You can have some villages that were completely destroyed, not because of the poor material that were used or the poor techniques, but because of the landslides or some problems of rocks. So they decided to have to deport them or to put them in a village right decided that it doesn't have that much of problems. This is one of these villages. So we had these different approaches and it was like a really case by case. We have more than 6,000 villages that have been touched by the earthquake, so that creates like a really diverse, also that has different topography, different localities, ethnicities, so it creates like a really case by case approach. It depends really on the location. On the other villages, we're doing this kind of rehabilitation because the areas, the map areas, allows us to rebuild on site, so it has a different approach. Also, with local material, more directly with government.
Both regarding your answer and regarding Hill Green, if there's any sort of like, or when there is any sort of financial setback, since there's a pattern in both cases, a pattern of these dwellings, a pattern that these dwellings follow, like they're sort of like similar in some ways and they implement similar rules when they're being put up. What would you do in the event of an economic setback where you can't achieve the exact same thing you've achieved with other structures? How do you sort of keep that consistency going in the area?
I think that one of the best ways to reach that is just creating some innovation and getting ahead with the legislation. We've been working for the last 5 years with the government to the promotion of getting normative aspects for these local materials. It's not just because we're romanticizing this kind of material, but it's also because it's really a strategical and economical way. And if we try to change also the rhetoric towards this kind of material, we can reach like this industrial scale of it. I think one of the most difficult things that we are facing right now is the knowledge towards this kind of material and what they can afford to localities and local communities. We can see it in that way. If you work with some house, in this particular case where the localities are really unreachable and really high, when you work with cement, you need to get back all the material from the country, and this costs a lot of money. And it also costs a lot of energy, and you don't make the money goes back to the city basically. But when you have this kind of arguments and giving back to the government, I think they're quite open. And the idea is also to follow up these kind of initiatives. And this is the most difficult part is getting the doubt that I had at the first sight is getting in touch with people that were aware that the real problem is not rebuilding, but it's also creating some synergies inside villages and also upscaling the villages and not going there. we can say that these villages were already vulnerable before the earthquake. But the idea is this is we can say it as a catastrophic event. We can also say it as an opportunity to upscale the villages. So basically, it depends on the people that you have in front of you and how much they like really engage in promoting some really sustainable way of living and how they can deconstruct this or made up idea about that Earth is really fragile and that kind of idea. I think that this is the most important thing. Then all the technicity can follow up like this.
I was wondering, what can we learn from the rehabilitation and the reconstruction that has been done in the villages, in the case of Turkey and now in the case of Morocco? And what can we learn that we can then apply to larger cities, such as Istanbul or Marrakesh? So that was my question, kind of, to both of you.
Okay. Well, I think that in the case of Turkey, I can't really say, but I think that we had a lot of similarities in what was stated. I think that there have been a kind of people tend to forget about some techniques when the catastrophes are not really repetitive, which is not the case of Japan or other situations. We had this really debate lately with some people of the association about Kutubia, which is one of the oldest mosques in Marrakesh that resisted the earthquake. It had more than 90 years old, and it's built with local stone. And when we see that, and it's basically, I should not give a wrong number, it's like 50 meter high. So basically, this is more about like the quality and the techniques and the application of this kind of techniques and the materials. We can either say that this is some has been materials and some has been or like poor materials, or we can try to create some filière or some studies towards this kind of material to promote them as a really contemporary. I think that's where the situation is right now. I think the idea that Morocco is really open to these strategies that we didn't have like just 5 years ago is really interesting, and it creates an opportunity also to push up this more and more. So if I had some answer to what you were saying, just look at the patrimonial aspects, not in order to preserve it, but in order to relink with what we have as a history and push it forward. That's basically what I might say towards this.
So my question is to Eren. So I was wondering, because we were kind of building on also Yasemin's, Dr. Yasemin's approach, and when it's perceived, it's a big chain of systems. So there's that connected to that, in both legislative aspects and like the act of constructing it, especially post disaster. And this kind of chain of systems also create this understanding that there's very little space to intervene in. And it was actually quite fascinating that these two followed up in a way perfectly, because this small community in a way was a very powerful example of what you can do in a smaller scale, which then could be kind of replicated, so on. So I was wondering, what are maybe the tools this community kind of use and utilize to pass on this information through one another, through generations, and how do they kind of keep the upkeeping of this, like upkeep the system in a way, and what are kind of the fundamental aspects that could be also shared to other communities that might want to do similar works.
Thank you.
In the last 2 months, what we've been doing and promoting is creating a formation center, but also working on some media parts. In this project, exactly what we're trying to do is work in 3 phases. The first phase where we will work with the promoter, and where we can have like local communities getting in hand with the techniques and everything. The second one, we're trying to push also the community to create some small-scale enterprises in order to take care of the second phase. And we're hoping that in the third phase of the project, we will give them back the whole empowerment to finish this project. The idea is also in the other projects is to localize one, let's say, the chief of the village. Basically, in these remote villages, most of the people are working in the built environments back in the city. So they will have a lot of visitors and a lot of villagers go back to the cities to work as stone workers or as masons. So we're trying to localize this kind of human capacities to form them and to give them back to the villages, and they do as a mediation role to form the other generation. The most difficult part of this is getting in touch with these really empowering persons. And also there is this problem of language, because we have different kind of languages and most of the languages speak Amazigh, so we have this kind of difficulties. And I think that this is not the most difficult part. The most difficult part would be how to push it in more like not an industrial scale, but to have this normative way of reception in buildings, normative laws on how to say this parameter is really receivable or not, and go back into questioning all that we did with concrete, actually, all the legislation that we did with concrete, and try to push them into some other materials than just concrete. That's what I'm trying to promote, actually, in also architectural school. And because the real problem that we have now is engineering problem. It's not an architectural problem or a designing problem. It's people that can say, yes, I can assure that this building will stand and I can make calculations for it. That's kind of problem that we have.
I think the question might allow us to maybe talk a bit about what scale might mean and how we understand scale. I think that's an important thing. If we're imagining the question of scale as a situation of, we take something that happens on a small scale and then we kind of build on that and scale up, perhaps that's an approach that I would be less inclined to support. But if we're talking about scale in the sense of the constellation, the whole group of already existing practices and examples, one of which was what I talked about, then we could see that there is already a macro scale to these practices. So I guess our interest should be in not so much taking, for example, something like I talked about, and then scaling it up, but really to look for other such instances, and they do exist. And actually, this is the way I also see the kind of spatial issue that you mentioned on spatial justice and earthquakes. This was exactly the point that we were making there, which we published a year and a half before these latest earthquakes, which was the point that the state tends to approach the question of resilience as a national security question. It tends to approach it with a kind of national security reflex. And this is, it's obvious when you look at the latest amendment where it mentions public security and safety, right? And those of you who are familiar with the context of Turkey would know how closely linked the notion of public is with the state in Turkey, in the language, kamu. Kamusal. Kamusal. Sal is this like weird suffix that you can apparently add to any word to make it like related to something else. And it's like kamusal is like state, like kamu is state, and kamusal is supposed to be public, but it actually translates also as state related in a way. Or stately, let's say, right? So this already tells you, it gives you clues as to what kind of publicness we're dealing with, what kind of public safety. And you see this in practice in the way the state actually approaches resilience with a national security reflex. So it actually, in my opinion, actively forecloses our opportunity to think on a larger scale by actually, kind of preventing already existing practices of resilience that have been developed by communities. And these are communities that have obviously experienced political disasters in the past. And if disaster is always already political, if something like an earthquake is not really a disaster inherently, it's just the way the earth moves. And what makes it a disaster is, well, politics and political kind of divisions and injustices. Then these are communities, as we heard also briefly in the first presentation that was touched upon there, things like minoritization on the basis of faith, race, etc. But these are communities that have already actually withstood and survived political disasters. And they're, to give specific examples, I would look for clues as to how to reconstruct, after an earthquake like the one that we witnessed, in a neighborhood like the one that I showed, but also in, for example, Assyrian Syriac communities who were victims and survivors of genocide from the early 20th century, and therefore were forced to kind of be displaced to a place like Europe, and actually they had been returning to their villages in the 2010s, reconstructing their villages, and that is a kind of example of reconstruction that actually happens post-disaster, right? Because the genocide is a disaster. And the kind of geological event that we see in the earthquakes, right? The effects of it are also shaped in this context that already has layers and layers of disasters politically. So I would actually look for clues as to how to think about the larger scale of community-based resilience in examples like Assyrian Syriac villages, in parts of, for example, the province of Mardin, or in neighborhoods like the one I showed in Istanbul, etc. I don't know if that makes sense. But
rather than a collective or like a state-imposed general sort of agenda, would you say rather like smaller groups taking action within itself when it comes together as a web would be a better way of tackling these issues, would you say? Or like what would be the difference between like a general agenda versus smaller sort of different agendas coming together? Because I guess smaller agendas would also maybe, in my opinion, mean more specialized things according to those areas. Like you mentioned, the quarry and the stone in the background. Those people knew their background better than anyone else. And to generalize that under a big umbrella would maybe do it injustice. So maybe, as you said, actually putting it down in smaller compartments might work better, or you tell me.
No, that's a great point. And what I would say in a nutshell is a bit of both. And this was the point I was trying to make because I don't want to kind of idealize, romanticize, lay people's practices. That's the point I was trying to make, that the neighborhood that I showed was already planned and designed partly by experts. It's a collaboration then between experts and non-experts, because the non-experts actually adhere to the initial idea that's laid out by the experts in the way they use the buildings, maintain the buildings, and this is the way then I would say how kind of expertise, science, etc. should be used in a way that actually is grounded in practices of the community. So it's for me a bit of both, and this is indeed what's missing. Obviously, I talked about the current government's policies, but also arguably the main opposition. If you look at the report that they released, I think a month after following the recent earthquakes, they just use the same rhetoric of we need to be scientific and we need to observe meritocracy, bilim, liyakat, all these words being thrown around, but in a very abstract way, right? So my interest is, of course we need to be scientific, but how? And we need a science that is actually, that collaborates with communities, not a science that overrides those communities, right? And they say, there's some lip service paid in, so this was the report that kind of like an action plan, not a report, by the Istanbul municipality, who obviously is run by a member of the main opposition. And there's a section of it that pays lip service to community-oriented resilience, or how at least the residents in neighborhoods will be engaged in the municipalities' resilience policies. But this is, I fear, the way it actually talks about this kind of community engagement is along the lines of this kind of generic idea of participation and participatory architecture, participatory urbanism that has already been like criticized over the past 10, 20 years, because it actually approaches residents as like anonymized individuals, right? It's as if it could have been any neighborhood, regardless of the characteristics of the people who live there, or regardless of whether the residents themselves have already mobilized and organized it, right? So this, I think, is exactly the problematic kind of approach to this kind of resilience question that is maybe more endorsed by governing authorities that completely disregards, even when it seems to want to engage residents, it kind of approaches them as anonymous, like politically, socially anonymous individuals, rather than saying, okay, here are, for example, as we have seen actually in the aftermath of the recent earthquakes, here are feminists who have organized in the wake of the earthquake, right, to contribute to the relief effort in a way that actually takes into account the specificities of the needs of women, of children. Let's engage these feminist organizations, for example, rather than saying, I'm gonna just like engage 100 people, like as if they're just data, 100 people that live in this neighborhood, right? And that's my idea of participation. No, maybe the idea of participation should be, again, if it's expertise in science or expert in politics, engaging residents, it should be looking at, okay, what are the kind of organizations that already exist who have firsthand experience, right, of marginalization, but also overcoming marginalization, who are aware of the needs of women, the needs of the racialized communities, the needs of others. How can I actually engage them in this idea of more macro scale, let's say, resilience?
I just wanted to ask if there was a Morocco side of the story of the same marginalization, oh my, I can't even say the word, marginalization issue, or sort of like this fragmentation. Because you're now, I guess, constructing for a community or constructing a community even. So would there be a sort of similar scenario in your case, would you say?
I think one of the more problematic issues about participatory is trying to differentiate between what is participatory and what are the problematics that are raising up to go into this. I'm really doing a lot of research about the medium that are that we can use to reach this participatory aspect and how we can go into that kind of topics without being really romanticizing these kind of things. Actually, the real problem that we can have right now when we go to participatory aspects is reaching consensus, which is one of the most difficult things that we can have when you have like a common state, like the government of Morocco that has like a clear policy. And when you have like local dynamics that also have their own way of doing things, the real problem is the communication system. We're trying to do it, local communities are trying to reach, to know what's happening on the terrain, but it's really difficult to do all this, let's say, horizontal kind of transmitting all the information to everyone that is implied in this reconstruction system. Typically, what we're living right now on the other project is we have different ministries that are doing different aspects of the project without communicating with one or each other. Local community that doesn't know anything. So basically, they're putting all in the hands of someone that can take in charge of this situation. So there is no designation about it, so it's either you take it in charge, and I do it because basically I'm really interested in this kind of problematics, and that changes from one village to another, and sometimes in the same village, depending also on the local community, on this sensitivity that we can have also from ethnic situations. So this is a really big topic, and one tool that we're using right now, like digital telecommunication systems. So having platforms that can give some visibility about what the government is doing, but also can reach out the communication system to the different actors. I think that we didn't reach a real solution system about this, but this is typically the kind of problem that we're facing right now. Not in the first project, since it's really a more popularized project, but the other one that is like directly with government is a little bit more complex. So because we're directly facing the different actors of the government, and sometimes they're like in different ministries, and you can have some sensitivity between one another and also the local community. So this is like the most difficult thing I'm facing right now to rebuild this system. Let's give you just a simple example. This process is going to give back a topograph that goes to the site and gives back the damage that has been done. This information is transmitted to the architects and to the engineer that needs to go back to the site and to assess the amount of damage, and then to push up like a conception about what needs to be removed, what needs to be assessed, rehabilitated, and that kind of things. The idea is we do all this work, and then you have a different ministry that doesn't receive any information about this kind of assessment, that goes back to the site and just talks with the community, asking them what we want you to demolish. So you have this lack of communication that can create a real problem in the process of the construction, but also in the process of empowering the communities to get back to their own resilience. I think one of the most dangerous things that we can give, or as a gift to these communities, is taking in charge of the whole state of the construction. These are the kind of communities that really know how to manage scarcity. So when we give them too much abundance also of information, they tend to lose all their knowledge, and this is really dangerous. I think that's one of the aspects that we need to notice a little bit about kind of villages. I don't have a really clear solution maybe in the coming months. I'm really working on it because this is a topic that really interests me about consensus and participatory aspects and different levels of participatory. But I don't think that anyone has reached any solution right yet. So we're trying to make the most out of the different experiences that are going on right now.
So building on the kind of conversation about communities, my questions to Eray in regarding, because there is this kind of repetitive nature of a big disaster happening and then being forgotten, and then happening and then being forgotten. Of course, not by professionals or experts, but by more kind of everyone. And I think, of course, it is also a coping mechanism, is it, in a kind of a bigger sense, because that's how people also deal with pain to a certain extent. But then, of course, there's this aspect of these kind of constellation of groups that we were talking about, and then the efforts that they kind of put in, which takes a longer time because it's much less people, much less kind of funds to do that, because I suppose that's also the biggest difference between kind of a top-down, bigger scale approach where a lot of financial support is given, and then which happens very rapidly and also happens haphazardly, to then a very much more slower approach, which begins to understand communities and how they work and slowly build. So keeping in mind that this kind of recurs over time, maybe what is a way to, especially for people that live in earthquake zones or countries that have recurring earthquakes, what is maybe a way to, or not, this is not a solution question, but what could be a possibility of staying engaged in this conversation throughout our daily lives, and being part, like, and accepting the fact that this is part of daily life. As you said, because earthquakes is the moving of the ground, and then we kind of turn it into disasters as humans in a way, or politics turns into disasters. So what could be kind of our agency in this position?
I just wanted to add like one point Yasemin mentioned, because before she left. So she was mentioning on like specifically on Turkey's case, she was mentioning people who had experienced like the disaster moving to other cities, because like this is basically trying to like run away from it, and also I don't want to say hide, but like, because if you're physically not there, so you kind of like run away from that setting. So in that setting, like in the new displaced community, there's also new communities like being formed. So adding on Mina's question, so what can also be the same in newly formed communities who try to displace from this disastrous context, basically?
I mean, I think it all kind of comes down to the work that communities are willing to do, people are willing to do. And it's a process, and it's about putting in the effort, and people are already doing that. But I would say maybe just as a slight maybe corrective, that I don't think the trade-off here is between, again, the kind of, the state being obliged to implement something on, let's say, a large scale or maybe temporally, like as a kind of immediate measure, and the more kind of slow, bottom up, as you put it, kind of approaches. Because in saying that, we still assume that the authorities have good intentions. I don't think they do always, and I think the work that they do is often actively about really. You can call it paranoia, you can call it something else, but really it's based on the fear that communities are able to actually organize themselves, and this is, I think, the problem, that I have yet to see an approach where the authorities will take seriously what communities are doing and the knowledge that they have, to then incorporate that kind of knowledge into whatever practice, whatever policy is being implemented. That's not something that I've seen yet. And this is what then the first question that you raised, which was, you said something like what was the question?
Previous one.
The first one that you started with, you had specific kind of point.
About passing information, maybe?
Yeah, information. Communities already have this information, right? I mean, example. In Ahmed, or as it's known in Turkish, Diyarbakir, the kind of largest predominantly Kurdish inhabited city in Turkey.
What's it called?
Diyarbakir, Ahmed in Kurdish. The kind of tent city, the state, the authorities, where they ended up choosing to build that tent city? Along the Tigris. Assuming that because there are dams, there have been dams for 20, 30 years, that's not like anymore the floodplains. But the communities know, because there were communities that were there before the dams were built, that's the floodplains. And if something happens to the dams, if there's a fault, that there's going to be flooding, which actually there was in 2018. A floodgate broke in one of the dams, and the whole kind of stretch of that river was flooded. Mm-hmm. So this is knowledge that communities have. But the state actually insists on building the tent city right at that spot. So I think it's about really how you use the resources. Mm-hmm. Are you using your resources to actively kind of undermine the knowledge that people have, and in so doing, seeing them as a national security threat? Mm-hmm. Or are you actually using your resources to incorporate that knowledge into your practices? And I think that is the crux of the matter.
Yeah, I think that's the general point that we all kind of get stuck at, because of course it's not what we discuss. It's not that the knowledge is not there. Also, the knowledge is there for Earth. It's been there. It's always like there are so many people that know exactly what to do. But yet, I think if there's a certain trend that a top-down system doesn't necessarily reach out to smaller communities to kind of learn or incorporate these things, then does that kind of leave us in the spot of, oh well, they didn't reach out, so I guess we're stuck here. What do we do then? Is my
no. The point is they do reach out. They do reach out. I'll give you another example. I was just in Ahmed actually. Talking to people who were involved in a more community-based relief effort. The authorities actually, it's not that the authorities didn't reach out to them. They did reach out to them about this kind of temporary housing that had been set up. Mm-hmm. Why did they reach out to these kind of, let's call them volunteers, these volunteers? The question they asked was, can you kind of help us, because we've set up this temporary kind of area for temporary housing, but we don't have the familiarity or the connections to the community to actually manage it. Can you let us know if and when like crime happens, or like can you let us know about any security issues? Yet again, we see an approach that actually approaches these communities through a national security lens. Instead of saying, which they could have done, the authorities could have said, here is what we've built, here are the resources. You, again, because this is already what they're saying, you are more familiar with this community than we are. Run it for us. We give you the resources, you can run it. But they were basically trying to prompt them to survey the community on their behalf. This is exactly what I mean. So it's not that there's no connection. There is connection, but the agenda or the lens through which the authorities approach the community is actually shaped by a kind of national security reflex.
Yeah, no, I understand. If you don't mind, I want to put a bit more pressure on this question. So, yes, so we've come to the point of the conversation where they go and talk to kind of the people that are there and that are knowledgeable. What I'm curious about is, okay, so they can say no, they can cooperate, or, I think it's the point where what's the answer? Because I think if the kind of the game, let's call it, shifts when the smaller community is actually starts to begin to be able to shape the conversation and what we fundamentally kind of lack. So that's that's kind of the breaking point that I'm interested in. Like, how do we begin as a smaller group, or if this group has maybe done this, how does that kind of begin to happen?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think the answer is to see discrimination as part of what we are here today to talk about as reconstruction. Like, unless you actually address discrimination, even when seemingly there is no disaster, injustices, as and when they occur, then when a disaster happens, that's exactly the kind of context in which the disaster happens, and its effects are shaped by that. Further examples, I mean, after the latest earthquakes, there would be people who, let's say, obviously, like I said at some point in the presentation, the kind of earthquake hit area is one of the most significant demographics that lives there is Alevis. So obviously, loads of Alevi communities were there, and some of them were taking part in the relief effort. And there were instances where people who were at the receiving end of aid would not eat the food that was prepared by Alevis. This is a long-standing kind of discriminatory trope in Turkey. So unless you address that discrimination, whatever else you do in terms of more technical idea of relief, reconstruction is futile. Similarly, there were kind of dom communities. Dom communities are kind of traveler communities, you could call them. And they were not given kind of temporary housing on the basis that they should be, or anyway, used to living in tents. Because they are travelers, because they are this kind of community that they don't deserve also food like other communities, because they're used to eating whatever they can get their hands onto. Again, long-standing injustices, long-standing discrimination. Unless you actually address that, or unless you see the kind of work of addressing discrimination as part and parcel of the work of relief, reconstruction, then I think, again, any such effort is bound to fail. So I think that would be my answer.
And when you mean, sorry, I'm panting, but when you mean by addressing, do you mean in a more national scale, or by what is this addressing exactly?
Well, through political work, I mean, through whatever is done, and whatever communities are already doing. Again, feminists, it's not that they organized only in the aftermath of the earthquake. They had already been organized, and they mobilized their knowledge and their resources then to help, again, women and children after the earthquake. So there is already work being done, and I think that's where I would look and where I would begin.
Could I ask a question on this level as well, about community participation and how different ways of participation are taking place? So definitely the discrimination that's been consistent historically and categorically plays a huge role, but don't you think there's different, we're not reducing down people to homogenous individuals that should be involved in participation, right? But don't you think there's competing agendas of different community reflexes? And within the community, if it's heterogeneous, then if people, perhaps unrightfully so, prioritize the security interests, and they think the security interests there are going to be their higher rank of problems, and they would like to prioritize that, how would you think about harmonizing those different community reflexes? Because in the Turkish example, I mean, it's quite obvious that there's been these discriminations, long-standing discriminations against minorities or different groups, but also at the end of the day, there's huge parts of the population who maybe in a fabricated way do see security or other related issues as number one problems. And I think the way to best solve this polarization would be to make people imagine a common future together, or perhaps reduce these problems that are more disaster-oriented to more depoliticized or dealing with political cycles right now, and perhaps try to make people imagine a common future together and realize they're on the same boat. So would you say that the competing agendas of different communities within a bigger, broader community could be harmonized in Turkey or elsewhere as well?
I mean, I think the key word there in your question was fabricated.
Yeah, that definitely.
Which
yeah.
I wouldn't say.
But it's still there.
The thing I would add to that is that it's not fabricated in the sense of it's just an idea. It's more than that. Obviously, the point is that it's like people are actively, like also physically, materially disciplined into fearing each other. I think that's the short answer to it. The long answer is there are already many practices. Also, there have been many examples after the latest earthquakes where communities that seemingly belong to different categories actually collaborated. I mean, the Kurdish kind of movement actively cooperated with Alevi organizations, for example, in parts of Marash. Feminist organizations did so. So I don't think that there's reasons for us to start with already the premise that there are competing interests, because there are many examples where there's no such competition.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to assume that there's competing interests. I mean, I think we actually can bind these people together around making them realizing that they are actually in the same boat and they have the same interests. But I guess with the political polarization having reached these levels, my worry is that anything that advocates for the rights of minorities or estranged groups within the population are automatically labeled as being against the state order. And that's not something that actively the state does, but a big chunk of the Turkish population of Turkey actively embraces this idea. So in the rise of this sort of new way of nationalism, do you think this is something that could be overcome? Like, do you think we could, like, these examples you gave are great ones, and like, how could that actually happen at a greater scale across the whole country?
Yeah, I mean, it requires work, and it requires the work that's already being done. That's what I would say. Yeah, it's not going to happen overnight, obviously, but just bear in mind that 5-10 years ago we were talking about very different things, and now we. So I think we shouldn't start from the assumption that people are inherently fearing each other, or they're inherently competing, which isn't always. It's not like a timeless reality. It might be the seeming kind of predominant phenomenon that we're facing right now, but yeah, there are many other examples to counter that.
Thank you.
I'm still wondering, like, how can we break free, I'm going to say, from the westernized lenses that our developing countries have and which we always tend to look at from. But also, if maybe this is going to sound a bit pessimistic, but if we're doomed to keep seeing the destructive aftermath of the earthquakes every time, because earthquakes are unexpected. In the case of Morocco, I don't think anyone was expecting to have such a high like earthquake. So how do we take this from the smaller scale, like the smaller village scale, to the larger scale? I'm still like curious about that. Also because villages, it's easier to like, we already find the community that's kind of resilient in a way because they all know each other. They live together. But in the case of a larger city, we don't really find that community resilience easily. So that's what I'm kind of wondering about.
Maybe I'll let Khalil Murad answer.
Well, I think one of the ways that we could promote right now is not about solutions. Yeah, basically, it's about an approach. And one of these approaches would be like to stay in these local communities to really get really interested in their dynamics to become local. You can see like really different ways of reactions from one village to another. We couldn't say like there is a typical case study of this community. We had like some villages that live a really big trauma with a lot of big trauma of debt, and that started right away getting back their self and starting some resilience, getting back their material, trying to rebuild right after that, creating some community management. And we had some different types also of reaction where communities didn't react for 1 month and just stay at place completely traumatized by this event. Depends on also the fragility of the community and how they're facing recidives of catastrophic events. Typically, I noticed a pattern. This is not like some scientific fact. I noticed a pattern that people that were like living right beside the river and that were used to that kind of rebuilding every time then after a big fall of rain and some kind of effects like this are quite used to this kind of resilience, having this kind of resilience capacities. And people that are also used to getting a lot of help from the government are quite fragile. So that's why I was saying that one way to get into the bigger scale would be like to promote a strategy and not a solution. There's a way of doing things, going into the community, talking with them, having some virtual, not saying that the government is always willing to put their agenda, which is basically true, but also trying to find where you can also intervene as expert scientists or also academics with the local communities and the local strategies, and that can promote also the agenda of the country. I think that we're all facing right now big scale challenges for upcoming years, and there is a kind of alignment between what the community wants and what they're used to live, and also what the government would like. And there is just a lot of vision, I guess, and maybe it's also our listening to these communities that we can have this kind of solutions, I guess. So that's having this kind of strategy would be like the best answer to do so. Everyone can have like different kind of adjusting to these strategies.
Yeah, it's true. We talk about strategies, not solutions. Thank you.
I will try to make it as a question, but just some ideas. When Eray and Halil was talking, I am from Antakya, and in Antakya there are ongoing post-disaster efforts, reconstruction by the communities, civil communities, and I know how it started. They were already architects, certainly, who are local and who are from Chamber of Architects in Antakya. They built up their own platforms and they were mostly there. There's also some central civil organizations like Herkes için Mimarlık, Architecture for Everyone. And also there are some local platforms who are pretty activist and would like to stay there and improve their society. But on the other side, there is this government-led architectural office prepared plan, which is basically, the post-disaster construction on the periphery of the villages of the city. This is one big project, and the other big project is inside Antakya, again to be planned by the ministry, but currently on hold because they started from the periphery. Now the urgency is for the quantity rather than building up the city. That kind of I think there's certainly a conflict and competition, but it's not between the communities. It seems like between the profit-based and state-led development plan and also the community-based, more socially engaged design process, which is one is slow and the other is more quick and without participation really. They are just exercising on behalf of people. And the interesting thing is, certainly in Turkey, there was this general elections, which the government has seen that there is no danger of losing their popularity in the region. So they are more strong, I think, after that election results, and there is another local election result. So I just want. I think when we talk about Turkey and the government regarding the reconstruction and architecture, we are pretty optimistic about how can a local participatory platforms can succeed in getting themselves into the reconstruction plans. But I wonder, because we are from Turkey and we are so optimistic, I wonder how the situation, is it more naive and non-competitive in Morocco case when you deal with the people from ministry and government? Do you get the perception, as in Turkey, that don't compete with us? We know everything. We can plan everything. So as if you are competing with them and trying to interfere a process unnecessarily, because this is what the academicians and these platforms are generally seen now in Turkey. I think I can ask this. And Era, if you have known any, connection with these platforms in Antakya, I wonder how you think about that.
Using the local association as a platform to promote that kind of approaches. In the opposite of what's happening, I think, in Turkey, Morocco tried also to have this quite literal directives, but in the internal commission, there was also big stages about the normality of this earthquake, also the big impact of it, and how it was quite new for everyone, also the kind of locality that it touched. So everyone was open to this discussion. We had a lot of approaches and discussion about how we can build, and different strategies were raised right afterward. But the more you go, the more you see that when you quite know what you're working on. I've been working on the rural areas for the last 10 years. I quite know this kind of localities. When you know exactly the local association and you know people who you can talk with, the government pushes more you can do whatever you want if you can give us the assurance that this will work. So that's the point we're at right now. Since we're having all the experts of the local community, we can talk a lot with these people. We just create like a dynamic in these villages. So the government is trying more to get to know this approach than to just block it. We had a really bad time in the first months to convince them, but then afterwards it became just more support like that. So I don't know, it has two ways of seeing things. It's not that the government doesn't have a policy of seeing things, but when they see that you don't have an alternative, so being a kind of a forceful proposal, they just tend to take decisions instead. So and that's also because of the timing on things, or because people are still living in tents and they started also reclaiming. So it depends. It depends really on who you have in front of you, I have some brands out there that are also working on the same approach, and they're still struggling because they have some people that doesn't want to go on some and move that. So it's a case by case, I think.
I will pass because I don't know anything about Antakya. I've only been there once, and that was for a day. So, and that was in 2010.
Where are you from?
Around Istanbul, Izmit, Istanbul. So I experienced the 1999 earthquake. I was 8 kilometers away from the very epicenter. So, but no, thankfully nothing happened.
Could you maybe, if you want, could you like point on the differences, like not as in like the damage of the earthquake, but as in like the aftermath of it, like how as a state we handle the situation, like in 1999 and also like the most recent one in 2023, if you want.
Again, my answer would be influenced by the way I approach this question of resilience, as I've been saying. The main difference, I think, is this latest twin earthquakes, because of the region where they took place, and because this region is, again, the epicenter of not just these latest twin earthquakes, but also, successive episodes of violence and marginalization, they demonstrated to us very clearly what is also the situation in other places, like you could argue after the 1999 earthquake in a place like Izmit, Istanbul. Basically, the importance of, again, situating our understanding of the earthquake in existing overtly political, social questions like discrimination. One thing that is different for precisely that reason is because of the region that these latest earthquakes took place. That, as we also heard in the first presentation in our panel, that there are already communities here that have survived those previous episodes of violence, and they have their own means of survival, and they use those means in one way. That means that, that they were much better prepared, let's say. The Izmit Istanbul case was less overtly such a region where you have these kinds of communities that have survived like decades of marginalization, at least in terms of the existing social formations, organizations, the way communities were organized. It was less overtly about those survival practices. And for that reason also, the question of aid and relief, I think, is very interesting to consider in terms of the wake of the 1999 earthquakes and the latest earthquakes. Because we seem to, again, be repeating the same mistake of approaching aid as an apolitical, non-political question. So that was the case with Akut in 1999, one of whose, and I'm not going to, don't take me wrong, I'm not against the people who were involved in Akut. In fact, I am for, to a great extent, their efforts. But the discourse around it is problematic. Like, if a certain relief effort becomes prominent based on the idea that it's neutral, like politically neutral, that's where the problem occurs. And this is what we've also seen with Ahbab. So I think it's interesting. And also, so for those of you who are not familiar, so okay, after the 1999 earthquake, there was this kind of organization called Akut, formed by, again, individuals, some of whom were also engineers, etc. But one of the kind of points that they made clearly was that they were not political, they were neutral, they were equidistant, so to speak, to any ideology, etc. And that really gained them a lot of momentum. And they did play a great role, actually, in the efforts. And they have played a role in other kind of disasters that have happened since then. But what ended up happening more recently was that their resources were confiscated. The association Akut was completely confiscated by the government, right? And this is where we see the pitfalls of a kind of idea of aid resting its significance on the idea of political neutrality, because political neutrality also means that when a government comes and wants to confiscate your resources, there's no community to actually stop that. There's no political formation, social formation to resist that, right? That's what happened with Akut. Akut completely was stripped of its resources. That's why they were unable to be involved in the aftermath of these latest earthquakes. Okay. Now you have Ahbap, this organization founded by this rock star, okay, that has been around for a few years. Yet again, their selling point has been, oh, we're like neutral, we're politically neutral, etc. Again, I'm not against Ahbap. I'm not against the guy who founded it, this rock star. I even like them. But again, my problem is what other kinds of approaches to relief and post-earthquake aid are overshadowed when we actually keep emphasizing the political neutrality of an aid organization. Even when people like donated or wanted to choose who to donate to, I kept hearing this like argument, oh, I'm going to donate to Ahbap because they're not political. Well, precisely because something like an earthquake becomes a disaster in a political context, perhaps the aid also should be political, right? Like that was the point that I was making to also many of my friends who otherwise are like very, very like politically aware. They're like, oh, I'm going to donate to Ahbap because they're like politically neutral. And indeed, what ended up happening was obviously a lot of like money was gathered on this basis. And then the state actually obliged Ahbap to use its resources to buy things from the state, right? And some of this material they bought was subpar, didn't withstand weathering, etc. Like tents, etc. It was just tents having been stored like for I don't know how many years, and they had worn out already, etc. But basically, all this money was then like channeled into the state again. And I feel that we haven't learned anything. So going back to your question, like from the 1999 earthquake, I want to stress, I'm not questioning the intentions, even the work that organizations like Akut or Ahbap are doing. But when we put so much emphasis on how politically neutral they are, then we actually are overlooking the importance of communities and organizations that are, well, inevitably politically oriented, because the kind of marginalization they faced for decades is political. Mm-hmm. And they are obviously engaging in aid, in relief from that specific embodied political standpoint and from that experience, right? And I think that's the kind of thing we seem to have not learned from the 1999 earthquake. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah.
I was just thanking our presenters for joining us today and giving us some really interesting insights.
And also thank you to everyone who joined, commented, listened, spent time in this room for this important cause that we seem to sometimes only remember when it's freshly received. So yes, thank you to everyone. And if there's anything you'd like to add.
Thank you so much for joining us, especially you guys.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Yeah. I think as a last note, well, first of all, one of the things that was a driving force in this, or one of the things I've noticed was when it happens to a area you're familiar with or a geography you're familiar with, then you're more concerned with the issue than if it's sort of far away or if it's only on the news. So the reason why we wanted to bring this here today was because we were all sort of like engaged with this topic because it was related to our countries. But we felt like it should be heard by many people who maybe haven't experienced it, but should still know about it because most of us are aspiring architects, and whether we're from there or not, understanding these issues could also highlight understanding future issues or different issues on completely different levels on context and topics. So that's why we felt like it was important to bring this here today. And thank you so much for bringing very different perspectives and expertise to the table. One of the things the main thing we wanted to achieve with that was that all of these expertise are different points and different sort of ideas in different contexts, and bringing these together, we felt like formed a constellation that would make things make sense and form a conversation where everything ties back together and sort of moves one step closer to tackling an issue. So thank you for helping us create today's constellation. And if there's any other additions, comments, thoughts, feelings, or questions, feel free to pose it to the panel, the chairs, the moderators, and the speakers, please.
I just wanted to, yeah, indeed, I wanted to applaud in words, I guess. I wanted to commend you for reorganizing this event, especially as students, and for prioritizing debate and conversation rather than, as you have been emphasizing, like rushing to solutions. And we know that urge to find solutions is very, very prevalent in architecture, in urbanism, in related disciplines and fields. And especially when you're students, you might actually be faced with that kind of expectation, right? And also to act as individuals is another tendency, right? And I think what you've done here, acting collectively, organizing this collectively and bringing collectivists together is really, really, this is your work. This is like a certain output, right? That is equally and maybe more legitimate than like a design project, I would argue, when it comes to such important, crucial issues like disasters. So I just want to commend you for that.
Thank you.
Upstairs in the front members' room, I think we will serve some exclusively Moroccan and Turkish drinks and snacks. So if anyone wants to continue having a no cameras conversation as well, you can carry on upstairs.
And thank you, Khalil, for joining us online. It's a shame you couldn't be with us today.
Yeah, that's the idea actually. I just got my dinner today. That's before the next time, I guess.
Yeah.
That's the other injustice we have to bear in mind.
That's another symposium.
Macro scale.
As per the village.
Yeah, exactly.
Also, to end this on a sweet note, sweet and sour note, in that corner, we mentioned this in the beginning of the symposium, but we advise before you go up for the very appetizing snacks and drinks, you take a look at that corner that we printed photos from Sirka in a dark room, which are photos of children that they've organized analog photography workshops with in these earthquake-prone areas. And these are the children's work. They're 8, 11, 13. It's insane. So we advise you take a look at them. And they're, if you want to purchase them, they go to donations. So if you feel like purchasing a print, the information is also there, but you can also get in touch with us. But please take a look before you go upstairs.